Oh, and Mia right behind you, walking towards you. She's here to join the crew and jump on your lap, as I would do as well if I was there in person. Muscle and Feels, ladies and gentlemen, the great return. I'm sure you're all aware that we've been putting out content on our respective YouTube channels and somewhat neglected this, but hey ho, we've both had our fair share of podcast appearances the past couple of weeks. What's your total podcast appearance number for last week?
For last week, maybe like 5. I feel like Muscle and Feels is as though we both remarried into a different marriage, and Muscle and Feels is kind of the child we had together, but now we neglect because we have new children to take care of.
That's how it goes. That's parenting 101. You get the
Hey,
first child and then
you're
you
welcome.
neglect it.
Parenting advice, baby. Muscle and Feels.
Awesome. And yeah, we are also expecting a a collab episode to be out with data-driven strength that we did on exercise science and its role and whether it's killing your gains. For those of you that may be unaware, there was also a debate with Alexander Bromley, like a 2-hour debate, essentially a Muscle and Feels podcast episode. Might be worth actually throwing that on here. That's what I'll do. So easy peasy. You can hear us live planning how we're going to reshare content so we don't have to shoot new content. And today we're here to chat about a newly published paper by us and the good people over at Lehman College, including none other than Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, soon to be Dr. Max Coleman, terms of conditions apply, Ryan Burke, Alec Pinero, and Jeff Nippard, the Canadian force. I don't know.
The Canadian oak, like Arnold
The Canadian
Schwarzenegger.
oak. The paper has now been published on the Journal of Functional Morphology and Kinesiology, an MDPI journal, because we do support predatory publishing here at Muscle and Feels. It's all an ironic sort of take. But joking aside, we decided to go with JFMK because it's open access, PubMed indexed, and there was a voucher for the taking. So we also made the peer review publicly available if anybody wants to check it out. But as you already know, we are very pro pre-printing anyways, and we don't really care about the journal hype.
It's factual. I think it was a cool project because it was the first to really look at technique, right? Other studies had looked at perhaps individual subcomponents of technique. You might talk about range of motion, or you might talk about tempo, or such things. But as far as one paper to try and synthesize, okay, what do we actually know about technique? What evidence do we have comparing different techniques and so forth? This is the first paper, to my knowledge, to do so.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the reason we opted for a narrative review versus a systematic review and meta-analysis, because, so disclaimer number one, narrative reviews sit pretty low on the hierarchy of evidence, because they are essentially us narrating the current available literature, us telling a story or telling our story using whatever available scientific evidence we choose to look at. But in the case of exercise technique, there are no studies out there directly examining the concept of training technique. And the literature is so limited to the point where we had to provide a definition for what exercise technique actually constitutes, because there's no formal definition in the literature. Usually you hear technique being referred to as the exact instructions given in each study to the participants of that study, with sometimes vague sort of comments on, participants were instructed to maintain strict form or to have appropriate technique without that really being clarified. So we defined exercise technique as the controlled execution of bodily movements to ensure an exercise effectively targets specific muscle groups while minimizing the risk of injury. This involves the orchestration of body positioning and alignment, range of motion, and repetition tempo. So what we did is we broke technique down in its different components: repetition, tempo, range of motion, exercise specific kinematics, and then essentially came to an evidence-based conclusion as far as practical recommendations go. I'll kick us off with tempo, and then I'll pass the ball to you for range of motion. Spoiler alert, things will get long. As far as repetition tempo goes, I came into this thinking that we're going to be mentioning something along the lines of, a slow eccentric and a fast concentric is probably your best bet when it comes to maximizing hypertrophy and making that adjustment to training technique. However, the current literature was more mixed than I had expected, with some studies showing a slight benefit to slower eccentrics and faster concentrics, but also some studies directly contradicting that and showing the opposite, with previous reviews sort of being around giving general recommendations for total repetition duration around 3 to 8 seconds per repetition. And after looking at some recent papers as well, we essentially said that it does indeed appear that a significant increase in hypertrophy can occur with repetition durations between 2 and 8 seconds, which then allows you to use a plethora of eccentric and concentric tempos. However, there's still more research that is needed to understand whether manipulating the eccentric or the concentric differently can lead to more growth. But in my opinion, at least, and I'd like to hear yours too, I don't think I wouldn't bet a lot of money on something completely changing the current landscape of practical recommendations as far as tempo goes.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Specifically, I think that we have a fair amount of studies at this point, such that if there were a clear effect of, hey, longer eccentrics cause more muscle growth, that we would see that in the data that we have. And so far, that doesn't seem clear. If anything, it's a relatively heterogeneous body of evidence wherein you might have studies that do find a small effect in favor of longer eccentrics, but then other studies that find that actually longer concentrics can be more effective. And it's not a very clear cut picture of one thing seems to lead to more hypertrophy. If anything, it's more like repetition durations of between about 2 seconds and 8 seconds from the sounds of things
Mm-hmm.
are reasonably similar with regards to optimizing hypertrophy. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, exactly that. And it's like there may be something to having an eccentric duration of around 4 seconds versus 2 seconds, but that something as it stands is not even like we don't have enough evidence to even consider it an educated bet.
How many studies is that based on?
So there
One, two?
was Yeah, like it was a couple of studies. So there was a review by Schoenfeld first that said that didn't look at dichotomizing eccentric versus concentric repetition tempo, and looked at repetition tempo in total. And they said that as long as you keep things between 2 to 8 seconds or something along those lines, you're good, and you can be flexible. But then there was another review, which was also a narrative review by Wilk et al. Shout out to the Polish homeboys. Pretty jacked guy too, actually. IPF bench record holder or something. I follow them on Instagram, and they conclude that a combination of a slow eccentric and a fast concentric is probably best. But that recommendation comes off a couple of papers that are not really that great. One paper found that when the duration of the eccentric phase was similar, prolonging the duration of the concentric phase did not increase lean body mass when compared to a faster concentric phase. But that was a study that did not directly measure hypertrophy, and they did not actually see any differences for pre to post lean body mass changes. So they even specifically stated in their paper that they observed changes in strength, and that those were observed in the absence of changes in lean body mass. And then there was another paper by Nogueira that demonstrated that a faster concentric phase resulted in significantly greater bicep and rectus femoris hypertrophy when compared to a slower concentric phase in a cohort, though, of older men that were above the age of 70. So, and when you look at the review by Will Catal, if you just read the conclusion, you'll go, okay, yep, that sort of confirms the things I've heard, in videos and stuff. But then if you look at the practical recommendations of the paper, they have a table that essentially gives you it's called optimal time under tension for specific training goals. And under hypertrophy, you have every possible every possible combination for duration in eccentric and concentric phases. So they list from fast and fast to fast and explosive to medium and fast, medium medium, slow fast, slow medium, extreme slow fast, extreme slow medium, extreme slow slow, extreme slow. And I'm like, oh, okay. So they were unsure as well. I'm not sure why they went out on a limb and said that. I mean, they were pretty cautious if you actually read the full paper. But if you just look at the abstract, it says that no, that's in the conclusion actually. Yeah. So if you just quickly look at the key points of the paper, it says um, neither isolated slow nor fast movement tempos are more effective for muscle hypertrophy, but it seems that the most favorable is a combination of slower eccentric movements paired with faster concentric movements, which is, again, this is another narrative review. They are giving their take on the literature, but I think that take is a bit of a is not a very
Overly
solid
confident,
take.
potentially.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So those are the details as far as tempo goes. We often hear, like RP, I think, constantly promote the idea of what is it, slow, stretch, focused, something like the idea of a very slow eccentric being necessary is promoted quite a bit without that being a bad thing. Because if you're trying, and I'll give you the mic now to talk about range of motion. In order to adjust for range of motion, it may be helpful to have a slower than usual eccentric repetition. However, if you feel comfortable keeping things, keeping your entire repetition duration around 2 to 3 seconds, and you're not really intentionally super slowing your eccentrics, you're likely to be more than fine. Passing on to you, range of motion. What does that
It's
look like?
another lengthened partial episode, baby. Let's do it. So, range of motion, huh? Well, it turns out his cassette tape. Range of motion is a part of technique. Ultimately, it's one of the few components of technique that we can clearly say we have evidence for. I think one thing we maybe neglected to say is that many of the things a lot of influencers nowadays are recommending you change about your technique to optimize hypertrophy just don't have evidence, right? Where it's like, all right, I really want you to turn your pinkies in on this next set. Turn those pinkies in, feel your lats, and it's gonna, produce a lot more growth. Those things we don't have much evidence on. However, like Pak said, there are a few things that we do have evidence for as they relate to technique. One of those is tempo, and the second one is range of motion. Now, the review paper on technique mostly basically paraphrased my meta-analysis and new studies that have come out since then. So I'll kind of give you the cliffs there. First, when you simply compare full range of motion to partial range of motion for hypertrophy, there's a trivial benefit to full range of motion, right? In fact, it says about 0.1. However, what this simple black and white comparison misses out on is the fact that partial range of motion training can perform at different muscle lengths, right? So when you're performing a partial rep at longer muscle lengths than a full rep, like for example, just doing the bottom half of a bicep curl, where your biceps are more lengthened, that's what we call a lengthened partial. And when you subdivide a partial range of motion into either being performed at longer or shorter muscle lengths compared to full range of motion, hypertrophy results do change. Specifically, doing partial reps in that top position at the peak contraction is worse for hypertrophy than doing a full range of motion. However, conversely, doing a partial rep in a lengthened position, the bottom half of a bicep curl, for example, is better for hypertrophy potentially than a full range of motion. Now, at the time of my meta-analysis in 2022, I believe, we only had 3 studies comparing a full range of motion to lengthened partials, where essentially partial repetitions being performed on average at longer muscle lengths than the full range of motion condition in that study. Because that's something that people have gotten confused, right? A lengthened partial within these studies just means a repetition and range of motion that is being performed at longer muscle lengths compared to its full range of motion counterpart. It doesn't mean you're literally training at the longest possible muscle lengths, right? Not always. And so we had 3 studies. Across those 3 studies, one by Workhausen and colleagues, one by Pedrosa and colleagues, and one by Kubo and colleagues, Two of those, Pedrosa and colleagues and Kubo and colleagues, in the quads, leg extension, and tricep in the skull crusher, had found more hypertrophy performing a lengthened partial compared to a full range of motion. Finally, the study by Workhausen and colleagues in the leg press and the quads, which used a pretty specific protocol. Specifically, there were no eccentric contractions involved, so they just dropped the weight. And the lengthened partial group did 9 degrees roughly of range of motion, so not a whole lot of range of motion, arguably too little to be ideal for hypertrophy, potentially. That was the one study out of the 3 that didn't find a benefit to lengthened partials over full range of motion. However, even this study didn't find any differences in hypertrophy. Neither group really saw hypertrophy, but the lengthened partial group didn't grow less muscle. And then finally, that was kind of the state of literature at the time of the meta-analysis, but since then we've had a couple more studies. One was a study by Cassiano and colleagues in the calves, where they compared doing leg press calf raises, so calf raises on leg press machine, either with a full range of motion, just doing the bottom half in that lengthened position, or just doing the top half. And specifically in this study, they found that at one of the sites measured, they measured both the lateral and medial site. At one of the sites measured, both full range of motion and lengthened partials saw more growth than the shortened partials group. However, at the second site, the lengthened partials group actually saw more hypertrophy significantly than both the full range of motion group and the shortened partials group. And so overall, this study lends further support to the idea that lengthened partials is probably something you want to consider to maximize hypertrophy. The fifth study, which hasn't been published yet and only been presented at a conference by a research group that's brought us about 4 studies now, I think, on shortened versus lengthened training and hypertrophy, was a study in the multi-hip machine exercise. So essentially, it's a machine equivalent of what you could think of as an RDL, right? So they kept their knees relatively extended and they performed hip extension, which is kind of similar to what you would do in an RDL or Romanian deadlift, where you'd be mostly targeting hip extension while keeping your knees relatively locked out. And in a study, they compared a full range of motion approach, about 90 degrees of range of motion, to doing just the bottom half, from about 90 degrees of hip flexion to about 45 degrees of hip flexion. So in one group, they got a full lockout, 0 degrees of hip extension. In the other group, they sort of kept they stayed in a lengthened position for the glutes and the hamstrings and the adductors. Now, they measured hypertrophy of the gluteus maximus and of the hamstrings. And by and large, they saw greater hypertrophy in the glutes and in, I think, two of four of the heads of the hamstrings. Whereas the 2 remaining heads didn't see a significant difference, but did, if I recall correctly, still see more hypertrophy, just not quite significant results, right? So overall, still more hypertrophy by a decent margin in the lengthened partial group compared to the full range of motion group. And so we have 5 studies altogether, 4 of which seem to find greater hypertrophy when performing lengthened partials over a full range of motion. Importantly, these aren't the only studies we have on the topic. There are other bodies of evidence that still compare more shortened training, like for example full range of motion in this case, to more lengthened training, like for example lengthened partials in this case. This applies to, for example, comparing lengthened partials to shortened partials. We have now 10 studies on that, I think. We have studies comparing isometric contractions, where muscle length doesn't change and is constant. For example, a wall sit at either longer muscle lengths or shorter muscle lengths. I think we have around 5 studies there and measuring hypertrophy. And then finally, we also have studies comparing a full range of motion to shortened partials, which again is a comparison of longer muscle length training, in this case full range of motion, to shorter muscle length training, aka shortened partials. Altogether, that comes out to be about 25 studies. And consistently across these 25 studies, you do see that training in that more lengthened position is more beneficial for muscle growth than training in that more shortened position. So the principle appears very consistent across a variety of muscle groups altogether and across around 25 studies now. And so while we don't have a ton of evidence directly comparing a full range of motion to lengthened partials, we do have sufficient evidence to say that, hey, we do want to emphasize long muscle lengths for hypertrophy in all likelihood. And that seems to apply across a variety of muscle groups and likely across a variety of training statuses as well. So it doesn't matter if you're more advanced or more beginner, you'll probably see a benefit. And so that's kind of the state of literature there. So I think as far as technique goes, the main thing to keep in mind is that, one, training exclusively in a shortened position is not ideal for hypertrophy. And we can state that with pretty high confidence at this point. If you're missing out on a lengthened position while you're training and your technique makes you skip that position, you're likely seeing less growth by a decent margin, maybe around 20% less growth. Likewise, there is less convincing evidence for this, but I personally think, and I think most people who've got a grasp of this evidence would say that there is now sufficient evidence to say that lengthened partials may be a way to see more hypertrophy compared to a full range of motion. And so, whatever range of motion you use in your technique should certainly include the lengthened position. And there's a good chance that because of how much more stimulating for hypertrophy the lengthened position is, you also want to exclude the shortened position to simply spend more time in that lengthened position that is ultimately leading to the majority of the growth, it seems. And one way to achieve that would be through lengthened partials. So essentially, you wouldn't get to your most shortened position in a given exercise, like you wouldn't lock out your bench, you may not lock out your leg press, etc., and instead spend more time and produce more tension at those long muscle lengths. That seems to be the overall recommendation for technique based on the evidence we have.
You heard it here, not first, but like, I don't know what time this is, 58th.
50 millionth time.
Yeah, exactly that. So, and that's an easy box to look at and make sure you tick. Or whenever you're looking at somebody else, if you see that they're skipping on that stretch, even if they're skipping slightly before they get a full stretch, in the context of making every possible educated bet that you can to maximize hypertrophy, then you can go towards them, slap them, and tell them, yo, your technique is shit. I read this narrative review on the Journal of Functional Morphology and Kinesiology. It's absolute horseshit.
The technique of the paper, or both.
Hey, Freudian slip.
Yeah.
As MF Doom said, slip like Freudian, your first and last step to playing yourself like accordion. And then my good friend Saul was like, wait, why accordion? You like that line works with literally any other instrument. And I was like, yep. Fucking MF Doom had us all tricked with his BS. A really cool section of the paper, which I found super interesting, was the
That's a bit biased of you to say, isn't it? It's like this really cool section of this paper that I wrote myself. Very self-flattering here.
It was cool in the sense that it's a bit meta, because in reality, like meta and meta shmeta, it's a section that gives you a bit of fuel to be the guy when you're there at the Christmas table, and you have some Christmas stable. We have stables here on the Christmas table, and you have like random friends of family there who also work out, and they're like, "Yeah, bro, technique, like it's the most important thing ever, and this is how I performed this, and this is how I bench." And we looked at exercise specific kinematics, and the main thing is that the majority of exercises were not created based on scientific research, looking at different kinematic configurations to find which one is best for hypertrophy or strength. But in reality, people, looked at applied anatomy concepts, biomechanical principles, and came up with exercises that made sense. Some which were refined over time. For example, the squat, which started as a forward knee bend, essentially with one placing the majority of their weight on their toes, versus having a balanced sort of weight, not displacement. What's the word? Weight
Distribution.
distribution. Yeah, there we go. I knew it was a D word. Yeah, as it is now. And essentially, as far as the current evidence goes, when it comes to modifying exercise specific kinematics to actually maximize hypertrophy, we only have a couple of studies. One on the calves, where they had people point their toes towards different directions. There is one where they changed the way participants were sitting when performing leg extensions. But in reality, when it comes to different grip widths, different sort of hand placement adjustments, whether you're holding a classic one in Greece would be to put your finger above your the rest, to put your thumb above the rest of your fingers when you're doing a lat pull down to target the back more. All those sort of recommendations are merely based on biomechanical reasoning, without without any direct evidence to support the idea that it will lead to more hypertrophy. Now, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but at the same time, we must be very cautious when we're making recommendations, especially nowadays where you'll see a lot of content out there specifically on optimizing technique.
I do agree with that, and I think it's comforting to know, to an extent, that the recommendations we can actually give for, hey, this is likely going to make you grow more muscle, are actually remarkably straightforward. So for a beginner who's really confused by the wealth would be the wrong word, I guess poverty of information out there,
Hmm.
um, it's comforting to know that ultimately, if you focus on these few principles that do have evidence behind them, in all likelihood, you'll be most of the way there. Yes, there may be evidence coming out over the next few years that, hey, the bros were right. You know, if you turn your pinkies in on that chest press, whoo, that clavicular head is going to grow a whole lot more. But equally, it's quite unlikely. Like ultimately, the degree of hypertrophy change you see is commensurate or proportional to the sort of change you implement. Right? Usually, like
Hmm.
to really see much more hypertrophy, you need to change something relatively remarkable about training. Like
Yeah.
maybe you're doing twice as much volume, or maybe you're taking all sets like a few reps closer to failure. It's unlikely that just by pushing your pinkies in a little bit on your chest press, you go from having no chest to having a lot of chest all of a sudden. So it's comforting to know that ultimately the recommendations we can actually make for hypertrophy technique in the gym are pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Exactly that. That's actually a really good take. It was comforting to see. I mean, we semi knew that stuff already, but the idea that because like for a lot of people, technique adjustments, especially with the amount of information out there, I can see how um, all that can be somewhat intimidating because there's like the way they're often presented is as if you are leaving a serious amount of gains on the table. And hey, it may be that some specific adjustments are actually slightly better for hypertrophy, but as it stands, we don't know. And in my personal opinion, I would bet that it's probably not a huge deal for even for those who are like relying on their training for their living.
I mean, just going caveman mode for a moment.
Google.
Um, if we were to take a very silly approach to, okay, how much does technique really matter here? And ask that question.
Mm,
If you look at a lot of successful bodybuilders, right, they
uh-huh.
do have a relatively heterogeneous approach to technique, which means
Yeah.
different bodybuilders use relatively different techniques, right? Like some of them use a lot of momentum, some of them use zero momentum. Some of them get a pretty full range of motion. Some of them half squat all of their squats. Some of them have very explosive tempo, like Branch Warren. Some of them have super controlled tempo, like maybe sometimes heavy duty training by Mike Menser would be a long eccentric and a long concentric phase. So
Hmm.
all of the things, and that's not even accounting for different cues, and God knows bodybuilders love different cues for different movements. Um, so ultimately, we're talking about a pretty wide variety of techniques being used in bodybuilding, and yet, even at the very top, people are still using a wide variety of techniques. And so, at the very least, what we can say is, even when we combine these variables like range of motion, tempo, momentum use, different cues, etc., it doesn't play so large of a role
Yep.
that you only ever see one kind of technique at the top, because
Yep.
otherwise you're being held back so much in your competitive hypertrophy endeavors. It's just not the case.
Yeah, exactly that. That's a really, really good point. Obviously, you have a grain of salt and terms and conditions apply, but I do think that because we are planning on doing a study in the summer, essentially looking at whether the combination of variables identified in this narrative review actually leads to greater gains versus not following these recommendations. And I do feel that as long as there's as long as you're not doing partials at short muscle lengths and you are still working with a sufficient intensity of effort, I wouldn't be surprised if the effect of training technique on hypertrophy overall has a trivial plays a trivial role. Now
Yeah.
there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah.
Unpack, huh?
Yeah, but we would see that, like you see C-bump training, and a lot of bodybuilders who don't have a really, really sort of distinct way of training, and it's just
Yep.
regular lifting with some eccentric control.
Yep.
That's something I didn't mention with tempo before. That although you can have any you can be flexible with your eccentric and concentric tempo, some eccentric control is probably wise. So not letting the weight free fall. TNC apply.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. What I'll say regarding technique as well is that I just don't think it plays that huge of a role. And it's important to mention that we don't really know how these components interact. And that's always
Yep.
the trick with both supplementation, for example, and also I imagine technique, where you might assume that, okay, if I use the best range of motion possible, aka length and
Hmm.
partial, you know what I'm saying? Maybe the best tempo possible, like controlled eccentric, and maybe I minimize cheating involved. let's say all of those give you on their own an extra 5% of growth, right? Just putting a random number out there. It's unclear whether or not by adding them together, you would actually get 15% of additional growth, whether or not those effects are actually additive, or whether to an extent, if you take a set to failure, you don't get additive effects. Maybe some of them overlap to an extent, or something to that effect. For example, that reminds me of a recent study by Hogan and colleagues looking at the effects of caffeine and citrulline malate on their own, as opposed
Hmm.
to a placebo pill, and then combining the two. And actually, when you look at just citrulline or just caffeine relative to taking a placebo pill, you do see that it increases performance while lifting, right?
Hmm.
However, when you then combine caffeine and citrulline, you basically see no additional benefit compared to just taking caffeine, right? So you might expect, oh, if citrulline helps and caffeine helps, if I take both of them, I'll get a lot more of an effect still. But in reality, that isn't necessarily how it always plays out when you're combining different variables that we haven't tested together yet. Which is actually a point that I think Alexander Bromley brought up in his debate against us. So I do agree with that on principle, and I think it's worth keeping in mind with regards to technique. And that's why the study that we're doing in the summer now, led by Dr. Pack, is going to be quite important, I think, in answering some of those questions of, okay, well, it seems like these variables play at least a little bit of a role, but what
Yeah.
about combining them? What about using them in their most ecologically valid, real life like contexts?
Any bets?
Um, Remind me of the study design for a listener.
I want to potentially not uh, publicize the study design, but like, okay,
Oh yes,
let's,
true,
yeah, because
true. No,
we
let's
may,
let's,
we
let's leave it
may,
then.
we'll
Let's
leave it.
leave it.
We'll leave it.
In that case, I would say, depending contingent on sample size being large enough, I would see an effect, but it wouldn't be a very large effect.
Yeah, I agree. The reason I don't want to share the study design is not so because we want to gatekeep it. Is because there will be some blinding involved.
I hear there's
Yeah.
been some gatekeeping of volume research lately. Like maybe there's some results behind closed doors that we're not privy to just yet.
Oh yeah. There's a certain duo out there. Well, more than a
Yeah,
duo. A certain university that we're waiting for to report certain things, certain meta-analyses. Zach
maybe
Robinson and Josh Pelland.
maybe it
Faster.
could like clear some doubts. I think there's some doubts in the air right now, or at least claims that there are.
Yeah, I think a really well conducted meta on training volume is due because even the Basval one, which was like it was fine, but like we need a proper beast sort of meta like we had with proximity to failure and hypertrophy for training volume, looking at a bunch of sub analyses, including covariates, blah 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 blah. So we sort of clear the picture a bit because lately there's been so much talk about training volume and accusations of bias. And I even heard like somewhere that like there was a guy, I don't remember who it was, but they were talking about the idea that most of the studies for volume come from the Lehman lab, when in reality is one, right? If I'm
Yeah,
not mistaken. And the meta-analysis,
yeah,
obviously, that was done
yeah,
back in 2016. But yeah, that will help. Overall, though,
yeah.
just to put a bow on the technique stuff as it stands, making sure that you're getting a nice stretch, using a tempo between 2 and 8 seconds, having some eccentric control, and following the general adapting actually the general guidelines on exercise specific kinematics. For example, how to perform a squat, put your feet, I don't know, slightly wider than shoulder width, adjusting those variables to allow you to tick the range of motion recommendations is going to be key. Aside from that, I wouldn't be much worried. I wouldn't be worried about anything else as far as technique goes.
Since this is already a lengthened partial episode, I want to give a
Yes.
bit more background on some of my thoughts around range of motion recently. Um, the recommendation I've given quite broadly, and I think is usually appropriate, is for lengthened partials to use 50% of your full range of motion. So to basically just do half reps in the lengthened position, right?
Mm-hmm.
The caveat there is that some of the studies that we have on lengthened partials are one in the quads, two in the triceps, three in the hamstrings, and four in the calves. Most of those are biarticular muscles, right? Which means that when we're training them only at a single joint, we're actually not even training them through a full range of motion. Like think about the hamstrings, right? Because they
Hmm.
both, for the most part, extend the hips but also flex the knee. If all you're doing is an RDL, for example, at the top of an RDL, your hamstrings aren't that shortened because you could still be flexing your knees and shortening them even more. So as far
Mm.
as range of motion for the muscle goes, in many of these studies, they're not actually even using 100% of the muscles for range of motion in the full range of motion group. They're often using closer to maybe 50 to 70% of the full range of motion, or even less, maybe 30 to 60% of the full range of motion in the full range of motion group, right?
Hmm.
For the muscles for range of motion. Whereas in the lengthened partials group, they're using even less than that, typically half of that. And so in reality, they're using closer to about 15 to 30% of the full range of motion of a given muscle, given that most of the muscles we've studied in lengthened partials versus full range of motion have been biarticular. Example, the leg extension study by Pedrosa and colleagues had one biarticular muscle, so not the biggest candidate there, just rectus femoris. The Goto study on the triceps had the long head be biarticular. So again, given that was included in the measurement, that would have also incorporated or involved a range of motion that was about even just 50% of full range of motion for the muscle, for the long head specifically. For the long head, the Cassiano study, the gastroc specifically, which is what they measured, is a biarticular muscle. And all they did was plantar flex the ankle, not also flex the knee. And so it
Hmm.
wasn't the full range of motion. It was about 50% in the full range of motion group. So 50% of the gastroc's full range of motion was the full range of motion in that study, if that makes sense.
Hey.
And so in reality, and finally the Mayo study that hasn't been published yet, we're talking for the glutes and the hamstrings. For the hamstrings specifically, the same issue arises again, where they would be fully shortened if you then also flex the knee, and they didn't. Whereas for the glutes, it is a relatively the full range of motion was 90 degrees of hip extension, and since the glutes only insert at the hip, that is a relatively full range of motion. But broadly speaking, so I would say maybe like half of the studies involved used biarticular muscles, where therefore the full range of motion group was training through about half the full range of motion, and the lengthened partial group was training through about a quarter of the full range of motion. And so for lengthened partial range of motion, you might actually be better off with between like a quarter rep and a half rep. So maybe even less range of motion than we thought when we were talking about the muscles full range of motion, right?
Mm.
The reason why I still think that for most exercises, just saying half reps is a good guide is because for most exercises, you're not actually fully lengthening a muscle and fully shortening it if it's a biarticular muscle. Like, for example, when you're doing a bicep curl, the long head isn't getting fully shortened because you're not you don't have your arm overhead and your elbow fully flexed at the top, even though it's
Mm.
a shoulder flexor. And so I would say generally sticking with roughly half reps on most exercises is going to be fine. But keep in mind that for biarticular muscles, you may actually be even better off going somewhere between quarter and half reps. And that's an interesting implication of some of the findings. Another interesting implication that I haven't talked about before is that while the more conservative take on range of motion at the moment is that you just want a long enough muscle lengths, and that's kind of that box ticked, right? Like you don't need to squat ass to grass to get the benefit. And there is some truth to that, where I think it's kind of on a dose response relationship, where to an extent, at least, the deeper you get, the better for muscle growth. But there is some evidence that you want to get not just deep, but maybe as deep as possible, right? And get to the longest muscle lengths that you can. Specifically, the Cassiano study on the calves. Again, the gastroc is a knee flexor and an ankle plantar flexor. What that means is that when you're doing calf raises with your knees extended, you are already pre-lengthening the gastroc, right? And so when you're comparing with knees extended, doing a full range of motion calf raise to a shortened partial, doing just top half, to just doing the bottom half, in all of those groups, because the knee is extended, the gastroc is already somewhat lengthened. So essentially, you're comparing the lengthened partial group that was training at the longest possible muscle lengths, doing just the bottom half with the knees extended, to two other groups, the full range of motion group and the shortened partial group, that were also training at relatively long muscle lengths for the gastroc. And still, in that study, you saw that training at the longest possible muscle lengths did still lead to more hypertrophy with at one site than a full range of motion approach, and at the other site than a shortened partial approach, both of which were still reasonably lengthened. And so while we don't have a ton of evidence looking at the longest possible muscle lengths, there is the potential that you don't just want long-ish muscle lengths and you're good. You don't. It's not like a threshold you have to cross. You're like tick, got the hypertrophy. It may actually be like, oh, you want to train at those quote unquote freakishly long muscle lengths. That's an interesting implication as well, but I'm not sure the evidence is there yet for sure to say that. But it's an interesting line of research, and I think just a few thoughts that I had around that research that I usually don't get the chance to go into.
Nice. That was a nice inside take. As far as practical applications go, would you say that pushing, going as long as you comfortably can, makes sense? Even if, like, for you, for example, when you do your dips, you can go super long, you can go super
Yep.
super deep, more than most people. Would you say
Yep.
that if somebody else can recreate that form without feeling any discomfort, it makes some sense?
Yes, I would say. Look, we don't have really at the moment a study where cutting your range of motion short and stopping the rep short of long muscle lengths leads to more hypertrophy. But we have examples of the opposite happening. So if you can safely, like, you don't get any pain and you can go deeper and reach longer muscle lengths, I think someone would be really hard pressed to argue that you'll see less muscle growth that way. And there's a good chance that you'll see more muscle growth. So why not take that bet?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Especially, and again, like, because a lot of people like to lose their shit. Like, we're not saying that, and as seen on your review as well, that if you were to not do that, you would not see any growth. We're talking
Yeah.
about who would see the most growth.
Yeah, and I've really made an effort this whole time to reiterate that we're talking about potentially like a 5 to 10% growth difference, maybe a little bit more than that in light of recent evidence, but it's not a huge difference, right? Like, you'll still absolutely see growth even if you just do shortened partials, which again explains why at the top level you'll still have people quarter squatting and having huge quads because it just doesn't play that large of a role. You can still make gains no matter your range of motion. But if you want to optimize your gains, the evidence suggests that you probably want to emphasize a lengthened position through lengthened partials, for example.
Nice. That's going to be a nice reel here that I'm going to pin and just abuse and send to people whenever they do the straw man of lengthened partials, aka 52 sets of lengthened partials or death. We are starting our official UK campaign for that to become official legislation. Unless you're hitting 52 sets of lengthened partials, you shouldn't be allowed to exercise in general, let alone lift weights.
Yeah. What are we feeling as far as hot take level now? We're calling people out.
Hot take. We also we briefly talked about exercise technique and injury. I'll go on a limb and say, as long as you keep things consistent, do whatever you want.
Yeah, and
Honestly,
as long as you're not getting any pain, obviously.
yeah, as long as things feel comfortable
Yeah,
and you're not putting yourself in a position where you're in pain while doing something and then
yeah,
you just force it over time, I'd say that you don't need to worry too much about back
yeah,
rounding or whatever.
yeah. No, I agree with that. I think as long and if you're obviously going to try new things, which a lot of life is about, um, you know, gradually expose yourself to those new positions. Don't just jump into it,
Yeah, for
which
sure.
goes hand in hand with you saying as long as your technique is consistent. Obviously, it can't always be consistent because otherwise you would never have started lifting in the first place.
Yeah.
That's starting a new technique altogether. But yeah, I agree with that. It may just be a thing of absence of evidence versus evidence of absence yet again, because we don't have those studies where it's like, all right, we took 1,000 people and made them either squat with their knees over their toes or passing their
Yeah.
toes, and 500 people just squatted with their knees behind their toes. And we saw that, oh, those 500 people squatting with their knees past their toes, they all got snapped up. We don't have those studies. And so a lot of it, unfortunately, is just mechanistic guesswork, really.
Yeah. But observationally, like, if,
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm totally open to the idea that certain variables may be more important in injury prevention than others. Like, and that may be exercise specific or like joint specific or whatever. It may be that if you're jumping and squatting with a very heavy load, blah blah blah, maybe that's worse than just squatting,
Mhm.
right? But at the same time, in a multitude of sports, we see lumbar spine flexion constantly. We see people doing strongman where they're moving at different planes of motion with loads. They're running, they're bending, they're doing movements that are not necessarily always recreated in the same way. Same goes with contact sports like rugby, even with people that play basketball. I think if the human body was as fragile as sometimes conveyed when lifting weights, we would not be able to do a lot of the things that we consistently do. So
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think it's just we're kind of fighting our way out of a deep hole that we've dug for ourselves. Namely, that within the fitness industry, we've been fear mongering around positions and exercises for quite a while.
mhm.
Like I was reacting to from my own YouTube channel to a few YouTubers, including Greg Doucette, for example, and the video I was reacting to, he was claiming quite strongly that, oh, this position, yeah, it's gonna snap you up. You know, like he said, for example, the overhead extension is a bad exercise because he got pain from it. And it's like, and he was like, yep, it's a dangerous position. It's like, I don't think that's helpful as a belief to instill within people that certain positions or certain exercises are inherently going to cause pain and long term problems. And the worst claim might just be like, oh, okay, yeah, you might not be hurting right now and you're fine now, but you know, in 20 or 30 years, and it's like the sort of the boogeyman just waiting to get to you. You know, like, oh, squat with your knees over your toes, you'll be fine now, maybe, but oh,
Yeah.
when you're older, you'll end up in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and even then, I would argue, and like this is just my opinion, right? I would argue that overall workload is probably going to detect whether things will catch up with you. So if you are a competitive weightlifter who's constantly like doing very like you're doing the same movement over and over again with high loads, and you're just like you're a competitive athlete, so health and longevity are not part of the plan. You want to maximize performance for those 10 to 20 years that you're competing. Yeah, that may catch up to you because you are pushing your body beyond its limits consistently to elicit strength and hypertrophy adaptations. But for the average individual who, keeps things relatively sane, still pushes themselves for muscle growth and strength, but not to the extreme. I don't know. I don't think. I don't know. That would be interesting. That was a thought I had the other day. Like whether like because we see that with like aerobic activity, we see that with some of the data on health and lifting weights, and whether for like injury prevention or like I don't know tissue integrity or joint integrity, there may be a sweet spot where you're doing enough resistance training but you're not YOLO freaking it, and that allows you to be healthier in like 20 years of consistently lifting. But I don't know.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I I don't know, man. It's just hard to
Yeah.
tell. And even if we were to try to glean certain insights, for example, from the observational data in, say, bodybuilding versus strongman versus CrossFit versus other sports, like, sure, you can try and compare the injury rates in strongman and bodybuilding, for example, and say, oh, on a 10,000 hour basis, right, for every 10,000 hours spent training, we see higher injury rates in strongman versus bodybuilding. Why is that? Well, there's about a million things that differ between the population engaging in strongman and the population engaging in bodybuilding. There's also a lot of differences in their training approach. So we can't even confidently say that it's like, oh, you're being more specific in strongman and less specific in bodybuilding or what have you. It's ultimately just very difficult to tell. And so we, for one, don't have direct evidence comparing one technique versus another and seeing what's more injurious. But even the evidence that we do have has a lot of confounders and variables that may interplay to the point that the only real thing we can say is lifting is generally pretty safe. You may have higher injury rates in certain
Yeah.
sports owing to a variety of factors than others, and that's about it.
Yeah, exactly. You're essentially doing something in a very controlled environment without random forces being introduced when you're not expecting them. Like, think of people playing even like soccer, football, or basketball, where they're not contact sports per se, but you could jump in the air and have somebody hit you. Obviously, that would be a foul. You're landing unevenly. You're twisting. You're turning. You're jumping and extending. Flexing your spine, bending, whatever. Anyways, movement optimism. Greg Lehman, biggest supporter, biggest fan. Marry me. Yeah, I think that wraps it up for this
Whoop.
episode. All right, guys, we'll catch you on the next episode, which will be released on. Peace.
Next check.
Bear mode. Peace.
Peace.